Welcome to the Fortean Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all the related high strangeness. I'm Bones, and with us, as always, is RamX.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. So last week we showed the receipts. We discussed the existence of 2,000 to 5,000 individuals who make up a decentralized network of financial titans, political titans, and intelligence cluster nodes. They wield systemic leverage to define your life, your wallet, and your reality. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a measurable, functional oligarchy. So today we are going to look to stay on this track, but dive a little deeper by looking at U.S. history and asking the question, have we always been an oligarchy? So when we look at this history from the robber barons of the Gilded Era to today's trillion-dollar asset managers like BlackRock, we don't see a changing of this game. We see a changing of a cage. And we are going to revisit the powerful concept of real birds in digital cages by Richard Thieme. We discussed this in our last episode 39. So basically, the Gilded Age involved monopolies surrounding steel and oil, and these monopolies dictated your wages and where you worked and where you lived. Today, we live in a digital cage that involves data and algorithms in the hands of the few. This is in the form of oligarchical control over the internet outlets and, of course, the fact that 90% of media outlets are owned by 6 conglomerates. But the goal is the same. Restrict the flight path of the real bird, which means restrictions on your autonomy, privacy, and access to the truth. And, of course, we have to discuss UAP secrecy, which is the ultimate caged truth when you think about it. It involves only 50 to 200 elites in the intelligence cluster that desperately keep transformative tech information locked away. So, Ram, let's start at the beginning. The article suggests America was born a proto-elite system. So what was the first cage of our founding fathers?
Yeah, so we're calling this the proto-cage, which is the founding era. So this would be right after 1776, right around 1780 to 1800 is where we're going to take off. And this is where we see the cage first take shape. And then what we're referring to as the cage in this case isn't obviously data and algorithms. It wasn't even propaganda per se at this time, but it was a cage of authority and ownership and wealth. So what we find at the beginning was that it was an elite system, but not a full oligarchy. The founding was shaped by landed elites, meaning you needed land to vote. So that was a big difference, right?
Right, yep.
And property requirements would limit voting to about less than 6% of adults. The early financial power was led by Alexander Hamilton, and there was concentrated wealth through the institutions like the First Bank of the U.S. So the early banks were able to centralize power and create this proto-elite system because power was still somewhat decentralized in the states. And if you didn't like the rules, you could literally pack up and move west into the frontier, right?
Right.
So the frontier became the escape hatch. And if you weren't making it in this world of the elites and the finance and in businesses, you could just pack up your stuff and build a farm or a ranch or go out to the west and make your own way, right? So this becomes important because I think that this attitude still exists today where, the elites have this closed system that ends up preventing us from being able to either be ourselves or get promoted to the point that we think we should be promoted or make as much money as we think we should make. So you say, okay, I'm going to take off and go west, right? I'm going to make my own fortune. I'm going to make my own way. And I'm going to make my own rules. I'm going to make my own life, right? And this starts to happen. And that prevents America from being a true oligarchy at the beginning. It was really a proto-elite society, right? Because you had this escape hatch and it was very real and there was opportunity. So you could still make your money. There was still an opportunity for meritocracy.
Yeah, and perhaps there wasn't really a need for propaganda as much because, you had to work you had to find food, and there was really not much of a middle class. And the government really didn't care if you went off and starved to death somewhere. You'd just disappear. That's just the way life was.
There certainly weren't as many rules around taking care of citizens or any sort of entitlement programs. There was no Social Security or Medicare.
Yeah.
So you were kind of on your own. But then the contract of what does the Constitution mean? What does it mean to me? Federal government power became very important to people too, because they were like, look, I'm on my own anyway. So why should I listen to you?
Right, right.
And this is a question people don't ask that much today. But as far as political power, the real control was through exclusion by keeping people out who didn't have land.
Right.
That was how it was originally set up, and that began the system.
So that process of people, moving out to the frontier when they wanted or needed, went all the way up to the Civil War, right?
Right. So all the way into the Civil War, you have people moving out west. You have people creating different communities, different societies, different states. And so America really becomes a true republic at that point. But then the Civil War happens, and it's definitely an economic war. There's a Southern class that wants its free labor force, or
right.
somewhat free labor force. And then there is a Northern class that has a moral opposition to that.
Right.
And the Southerners' argument is that, well, your money doesn't rely on this type of slave labor, so you don't care. And then the Northerners' argument is you shouldn't be doing slavery anyway. So this begins, right, the stuff we sort of see today, where you have elites who say, whatever I want, I should get, or whatever I can take is mine. And then you have other ones who say, no, that's not right. And so we talked about last time how you have billionaires saying it's my version of the world. No, it's my version of the world. Well, this all happened back then in the Civil War, and I understand many other things were happening here. But we are really just talking about levers of power and who owns them in this episode. So the balance of power after the war definitely shifted to the North. And it also began the industrial age somewhere around the 1870s to the 1900s.
Right. So then you have the industrial age come about, and the factories were built. A lot of the factories were built in the North, and a lot of the power was in the North, mainly because of the lack of air conditioning. Air conditioning didn't exist, but that's when you have the oligarchy, because you start to have kind of the functions of the oligarchy. You have the bird cage start to be developed, where you become reliant on these captains of industry, the Rockefellers of the world.
And we would measure that becoming a true oligarchy at this point by the means of production and control being held by a few hands instead of many. Those are the metrics that we were looking at. Who really owned all the wealth? Who really had the voting power? How much power did the people exercise during the period? Those were the metrics that we're looking at to say during which periods was America an oligarchy and was it not? And this was a period when it went full oligarchy, because these robber barons came in and they held monopolies, and there was no antitrust laws. So there was nothing stopping them from owning all of it, owning all of the railroads, all of the steel. So they were setting all of the prices and then dictating all of the policies related to it. And they definitely were buying up politicians left and right. Tycoons bribed Congress using the equivalent of around $50 million in modern lobbying. And Standard Oil's monopoly is the historic parallel, I would say, to BlackRock's modern reach. In terms of how they control corporate policy, that's what Standard Oil was doing at the time. So we're ultimately going to get to today, and we're looking at all of this with today in mind. But the industrial cage during this period was built out of steel and oil. Those were the things that were really driving industry at this point. So that made Rockefeller from Standard Oil, the monopoly was the literal cage that people were in. Right. They worked for them, they paid them, and they were dictating opening stores. Yeah. They were dictating costs and access. So the real bird of small business was crushed by horizontal and vertical integration of these monopolies. If you were a small unit miner or something like that, you were going to get crushed. They were just going to push you out. Like that movie, There Will Be Blood. Did you ever see that? Daniel Day-Lewis, great movie, where he's the oil tycoon.
Yeah.
They had a great SNL skit based on that too. But that type of I eat you, I drink your milkshake, that was the era, right?
Right. So it's interesting to talk about this digital cage now because, when you talk about my interpretation of this, the birds and digital cages is that, if you've ever had a pet bird, the birds often prefer their cage, right? They come out,
right.
They fly around, but then they want to go back in, and they choose to go back in.
Those are the walls of the cage.
Right.
It's the ones that you create and the ones that say the cage is more comfortable than the truth.
Right.
But at this point, the cage was physical and economic, and the elite were easy to spot. They were the guys who owned the railroads, the factories, and their control was over the physical flow, how things moved.
Right.
And the cage laws favored the industrial builders, the people that were building the physical stuff, that owned the physical resources. And so Thieme's concept of that digital cage was utterly dependent on the Gilded Age system. So if Rockefeller controlled the oil for your lamp and the railroad that moved your crops, your autonomy and your travel was entirely managed by them. So this sets the stage, during the Industrial Revolution for people who go into factories, the conditions get really bad, and then there's pushback.
Right. Yeah, so this ultimately, at the turn of the century, ultimately creates pushback, social pushback, because the conditions just get so bad. You have people starving in major cities or freezing to death. And, the social programs, the idea of social programs to combat it start to arise. And just that, I guess the general idea of inequality.
Yeah, conditions get so bad following the Industrial Revolution that there is a big pushback. And like in Russia, that ends up being the push towards communism.
Right.
And like in Germany, we didn't mention this during our World War II stuff, but the Nazis sort of tried to push socialism too in the very beginning. And they were like, hey, what if we, gave you some of everything too, right?
Right.
And then, that all went out of the way very quickly and they became a fascist regime.
Right.
But that's what they were trying to sell it in as because it was popular.
It was trendy, yes.
Yes. So this push towards socialism in the U.S. makes people realize that we need reforms or that's what's going to happen. Most prototypically, I would say Karl Marx laid this all out. He said, what's going to happen always in an oligarchic system is that the elite will take too much and they are too small of a group so that the larger group eventually says, we're going to go take all of that and redistribute it amongst ourselves. That is the heart of socialist communist thought, is that is always going to happen. And we can see many examples of that happening. And it's only natural. Marx just thought that was the natural way of the system.
Right.
And so, great thinkers in America got ahead of that. And they said, hey, let's get ahead of that and we'll put in reforms and things like entitlements and Social Security and Medicare. And this will prevent the lower classes from eventually saying, hey, let's go take it all from the elites. But it's always been this game of how much do we have to give them?
Right.
They're playing this game very publicly right now with Social Security and Medicare and saying, okay, how much can we really get away with not giving you? And that's all they're saying.
Right.
That's all this is, as we'll see. So in the 1900s, the cage starts to weaken. But secrecy starts to rise in response. Because the elites see that their power is threatened, there's a movement towards gaining more governmental power. They start to install people in positions in government, as well as a lot of people in intelligence, as we'll come to see. So there are progressive reforms like antitrust laws in the 1920s and 30s, and then there was the New Deal, which expanded the middle class. So that was the response. You push back on the elites, and what happened in the New Deal? The middle class grew. Mm-hmm. This is undeniable. But what do the elites tell you that the New Deal is? Oh, this is communism.
Right.
It's growing your middle class. It's communism. All that money should come to us. And this game has been going on forever. And politics are mostly just a mask for this same conversation. Everything that happens in politics is mostly just a mask for this conversation. How much money do we really have to give you in order for you to not revolt?
Right, right.
So we see the middle class grow through the 20th century. And we see a educated populace start to rise.
Right.
So in response to this, the educated populace is starting to say, hey, what about this? What about that? They're doing exactly what we're doing, right? Where they're saying, you know what? Some of this stuff doesn't make sense. Let's put it together and start to share ideas and say, hey, how are we being controlled? So the new game becomes intelligence, secrecy, and influence.
Right. They can't just say no more schooling, no more education for the masses. But, it's a clear trend. You could see it in developing countries where they start to develop and they start to get a middle class, an educated middle class. And what happens is people, like you said, they start to question. And there starts to be, more and more public demonstrations, questioning power. And that's just kind of the natural, when you have an educated population, that naturally happens.
Yeah, the Nazis are a good blueprint for this, and we went through it all, so we can reference it from our World War II episodes, where they went in and immediately realized that they had to control both the education department and religion.
Right.
They needed to control those two things because they wanted to control beliefs. So in the 20th century, the elite started to realize that controlling physical assets like factories and just resources like oil wasn't enough. There was a lot more opportunity. So the new strategic asset became knowledge and truth. Who owns that? And you could say all of media ends up in this category. Even fiction. Because through fiction, you can tell a story. You can tell morality stories. And we can look to the UFO topic to watch the evolution here, and so much of this ends up brushing up on the UFO topic because there is no difference between the UFO topic and everything else. It's been happening this whole time. It is a part of your history. You're just not allowed to talk about it for whatever reason.
Right.
And one of those moments that's pertinent to both the UFO topic and our discussion today is that moment when the OSS becomes the CIA. That's such an important moment that we always go back to because who was involved at the time? It was these people, these elites. And who did they get together? They got together the Vatican, they got together organized crime, and they got together the pre-existing spy network. And so much of the last 80 years ends up being informed by that moment. So at this point, the real bird becomes information. The walls of the cage become information. It's now captured and it's labeled as classified, or it's misinformation and disinformation. But none of that is possible until the age of mass media.
Right. And then you throw in the constant algorithms now that are being controlled by very few.
So was this era an oligarchy? It ends up being mixed because of the New Deal, because of trust reforms, the middle class rising. That is a clear example of the oligarchy shrinking. And then later in the late 20th century, as we'll start to see, it starts to become more a modern oligarchy as centralized control of wealth starts to become the word of the day. Economic democracy was up, but a new deep state secrecy. Everyone loves the deep state secrecy, right? And here we'll actually say this is where it lives. This is where it is. It was introduced by elites in the intelligence community. It was think tanks, Council on Foreign Relations, those sorts of things. That's what introduced the so-called deep state. And these are people that operate on behalf of that elite financial network. That's what I would define as a deep state, not the bureaucrats at the DMV.
Yeah, right.
They're on the list.
Yeah.
But this is the hinge point in the digital cage. So the old visible industrial cage that had physical walls was replaced by the invisible information secrecy cage, your beliefs cage. This is when it really became a thing. And this became a necessary prelude to what we would get into today as the digital cage.
Right. So to sum up, we started out with like a proto-elite system where, like you said, it was basically landowners that were running the show. And really,
right.
And then we got, we get the
1780s to mid Civil War, mid 1800s.
Right, right. And then we go to the functional oligarchy in the mid 1800s to the Gilded Age, and then we kind of move into the more modern one now that we have. It's more informational and digital.
Right. So the 20th century ends up being a mixed bag. We go from this functional oligarchy that happens in the Gilded Age, and then that ends up getting pushed back. So we sort of remove it from the oligarchy's control for a moment, and then they get it back toward the end of the 20th century. The monopolies start to rise.
Right.
So this modern era we call the post-1980s to today. And yes, I'm going to give you the old Fortean Winds bury the lead. It's becoming a modern oligarchy.
Yeah, and we did mention Peter Thiel last episode, and it has to be mentioned again because he just news just came out about his talks. So he talks about the Antichrist a lot, right? And he's part of some organization called Acts 17, I believe it's called. It stands for Acknowledging Christ in Technology and Society. So he's got a really interesting spin on it all, and it has to do with, of course, him building a bunker so he can save all of his billions in the apocalypse. But they seem to be he's promoting, and it's not just him. There's a group of these billionaire tech folks that are spreading this kind of idea that they're almost afraid of people being anti-AI. And they think that that's going to bring the apocalypse. It's very strange. I don't.
He's a great example of a modern oligarch. So weird and and so disturbing. Yeah, let's talk about him for a second before we talk about the structure of the modern oligarchy. So he has this talk about the Antichrist later. So Peter Thiel, for those who don't know, he grew out of the PayPal mafia, which means he was an early investor in PayPal, and then he was an early investor in Facebook, and he now owns Palantir, numerous other government contracts. He's been an investor in many things. He was an investor along with Epstein in some stuff, so he's connected there. He's, everywhere. And let's hit some highlights on Peter Thiel. He's an openly gay man, which I think ends up becoming relevant because he keeps trying to court Christian groups that are not cool with gay. So you got to ask yourself why. Why would someone do that?
Yeah.
And then he's got this weird interest in the Antichrist, which I really think is a licorice mustache. I don't think he's very interested in any of this at all.
No.
He had a podcast conversation in which a clip went very viral. He was asked something along the lines of, do you think humanity should continue on and persist? And he couldn't answer the question.
He's frozen. Should be an easy
What
yes.
is your vision of the future that doesn't involve humans?
Right,
what is that? So you're going to tell me that this guy is a Christian, that he's somehow, and you almost wonder if he's trying to interview for the job of Antichrist with all of this stuff.
Right.
And he keeps trying to court Christian believers because he thinks that they're easy targets, like we've talked about. And he thinks that, I can get them on my side to push my AI in order to prevent the Antichrist? What
Yeah.
are you saying your robot versus the Antichrist? No, thank you. Like,
Yeah,
that's nowhere in the Bible, dude.
it all seems very convenient because like one of the founders of this Acts 17, it's called Acts chapter 17. He's also a venture capitalist, and he's in the defense. He has a defense contract as well. He has his own defense contract, so he's part of the same very tight knit group there.
Yeah, he's trying to say environmentalists are Antichrist. Anyone who gets in my way. Like, this has been going on since that proto-elite era. You know, Benjamin Franklin ends up getting involved in the Jersey Devil story because he's calling one of his opponents, you know, in league with the devil.
Right.
So this has been going on since the beginning. Like, they've been trying to use the devil to get people on their side, to allow them to do whatever it is they want to do. In this case, he wants to own all of your information and become your surveillance overlord.
Yeah.
And he's telling you that he's doing it to prevent the Antichrist?
Right. And it doesn't make any sense because he frames this whole Antichrist discussion with the idea of being anti-science. But then he's anti-climate activist who promotes climate science. It doesn't make any sense.
No, Peter Thiel is a great example of someone who is just richer than us.
Right.
He is clearly bizarre and weird, and he doesn't make any sense, and he's just a
big jerk.
Anyway.
But yeah, it's just too convenient. He's worth $20 billion, and he's worried about losing his money? You can't forget the size of $1 billion. It's just unbelievable. We're desensitized by how much money that actually is. And it just seems too convenient for me. And it's just another example of basically they're using the book of Revelations to just manipulate the masses.
Once again, yes.
That's all it is.
Just like the book predicts. You know, just like the book predicts that this will be used for this purpose. It warns you in the book.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't even, and I brought this up before episodes ago, but, you know, there's a lot of skepticism of the book of Revelations because it was added to the New Testament, the 4th century? It wasn't one of the original books. And, you know, I think some Eastern Orthodox churches, leaders, were skeptical of it, and it doesn't even, it's not included in their version of the Bible. So it wasn't there in the beginning, but someone at some point in history knew that it was necessary to basically as an instrument of control.
And what they don't control through religion, they control through control over your wealth. And that is what's happening from the 1980s to today, which is basically wealth concentration exploded. The top 1% share rose from 10% to 32% of wealth by 2024.
Yep.
So from 10 to 32%. That's how we know we're in an oligarchy. You have no control.
Yeah.
Now the mechanism of control has become digital. The cage is invisible. It is systemic. The 2,000 to 5,000 elites now control power via systemic leverage.
It's very powerful because just like, you know, the bird in the cage, we are choosing to go into that cage by doom scrolling an algorithm all day long on our phones. It's incredibly powerful, and they know it.
So corporate media consolidation is now complete. 90% of media is held by 6 firms. Google has a 90% search share. Policies are aligned with elite interests 80% of the time. I want to repeat those stats one more time. So 90% of media is owned by 6 firms. Google owns 90% of search share.
Wow.
All of these policies are aligned with elite interests 80% of the time.
Yep.
We can back all of that up with real data. So don't tell me that this is a conspiracy.
No.
And in fact, who calls it a conspiracy? The media tech conglomerates are the architects of Thieme's digital cage. They don't restrict you with an iron bar. They restrict your flight path with an algorithm. You feel free, but 60% of what you see online is curated, and then you end up self-censoring.
Right.
We mentioned last time that the NSA's PRISM program collects 1 billion records daily. And this is the ultimate expression of the oligarchy's need to know everything. They have to, their fear, as we pointed out, like their fear is constant, and they have to know everything and know what you're doing all the time. Now they're passing laws to get all of the membership rolls and interaction logs from gun rights groups.
Oh, wow.
Why are they so worried about that?
Yeah. Yikes.
The modern oligarchy governs the 2,000 to 5,000 people who run BlackRock, and that's the biggest asset manager in the world, and Google. They govern by data collection and narrative control because the physical cage is obsolete.
Yeah, it's interesting because we are on the doorstep of being in a complete surveillance state, and it's really not getting that much airtime. Really, it's not being talked about enough. And you think about when this discussion first came up, when we had the Patriot Act after 9/11, right? And people were up in arms about that because there were a lot of personal freedoms, rights of privacy being violated. But that was before we had the doom scroll. That's before we had like social media. It wasn't that big. And so I think people could concentrate on it a little more as a topic, and discuss it. Now it's just complete, it's the term, it's being overused now, but flooding the zone. And so it's just, we're all being distracted at the same time.
We get to see this close up and personal with the Epstein files. We get to see how they're flooding the zone with every possible thing to avoid those Epstein files. And we know that this hits them. The Epstein files hit them, and that's what they're doing. So you get to see this all happening firsthand and in clear view. And I think we were going to talk about some of the Fortean angles here and how all of this is utilized to keep all of the UAP and paranormal information away from you. However, I think that that's really evident as far as this is concerned, and we'll go into more of the specifics next time.
It sounds like a plan, and we should also just look into how it can be combated, right? Some awareness on this cage that we're putting ourselves in. I have a theory. Maybe I'll talk about the theory next episode. But AI is kind of making human activity generic in a way, and it might open up eyes because everything, the doom scroll and the algorithms might just start looking too familiar all the time, and people might finally start looking beyond their walls.
Some of that is happening. There is hope there.
Yeah.
I do see hope in the fact that all of this exists. Like there's an alternative media world that is echoing similar sentiments that we are right now. That's saying, hey, these are the walls of your digital cage. And if you can start to see the walls, you can start to look for ways out.
Yep. Well put. All right, well, good talking to you again, Ram. We'll expand on this next time.
Same to you, Bones.
All right, thanks everyone for listening. You can always visit our website at forteanwinds.com. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, y'all.